Our top story today, Russian strikes have killed 3 people in the Kyiv region overnight, according to a Ukrainian official, as the two countries fired drones towards each other's capitals. This comes as Kyiv and Moscow carry out the biggest prisoner swap since the start of Moscow's invasion. Russia's overnight attack on Kyiv wounded at least 10 people, according to Vitaly Klitschko, the city's mayor, who also warned residents to stay in shelters. Moreover, overnight attacks were also reported in Kyiv and Kherson regions. Meanwhile, in Moscow, restrictions were imposed on at least 4 airports, including the main hub Sheremetyevo, as part of the Russian Civilian Aviation Authority. Mayor Sergei Sobyanin said that the 12 drones flying towards the Russian capital had been intercepted. Furthermore, after overnight drone and missile strikes on Kyiv overnight injured at least 15 people, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has once again raised calls for sanctions on Russia. Here's what he said.
Був дійсно масштабний та підлий російський удар. Балістика, частину ракет вдалося збити. Було також 250 дронів, більшість шахедів. Щоночі наші сили працюють для захисту життів. На все це потрібна реакція. Жорстка реакція Сполучених Штатів Америки. Реакція Європи. Реакція всіх світів, хто хоче завершення війни. Путін відмовився від припинення вогню вже неодноразово. Це нічого йому не дає, крім того, що кожного дня він забирає життя. Кожен день дає приводи для нових санкцій проти Росії. Кожен день доводить, що без тиску на Росію війна триватиме.
We're now joined by Professor Veselin Ivanov-Popovsky, who's a professor and vice dean at Jindal Global Law School, New Delhi, India. Thank you very much, Professor Popovsky, for joining us on the programme. I first of all actually want to start with this prisoner swap that's just occurred, the largest prisoner swap of the entire conflict. I was wondering, does this, because this was an agreement made in Istanbul after their first direct talks, does this signal a diplomatic opening, or is it purely a pragmatic move, do you think?
I will go with the second, Thomas. It's a pragmatic move. It doesn't need a meeting on a high level in Istanbul. Those swaps can be decided by the generals in the battlefield. They happen all the time in every war. In the First World War, Second World War, between the worst enemies, such swaps are possible. Between Israel and Gaza and Hamas, they also happen. Yes, the attempt by the Russian side in the Istanbul negotiation to put this as a big achievement actually is not. It's something very normal under international humanitarian law to swap prisoners of war. It happens all the time, even back in centuries. So this is probably another attempt by Russian propaganda to show this as some willingness to negotiate, but we don't see the actual negotiations for a ceasefire. Russia continues to deny even a 30-day, not an unconditional ceasefire, something which is on the table for many, many weeks now, including by the US administration, by all the Europeans, and by Ukraine. So yes, swaps do happen. They are part of international humanitarian law, but I wouldn't say this is some achievement. And exactly the strikes you mentioned, Thomas, the continuous shelling of big cities, including Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, shows exactly the opposite. Russia is unwilling to negotiate even a minimal ceasefire.
Precisely what I wanted to speak about next is the fact that these global peace talks are on the world stage. Everyone's looking at what's going to happen, whereas this conflict is still escalating. People are still being killed, as you said, in Kyiv. It happened today, 3 people killed in the Kyiv region. Can I get your thoughts on the current state of what's going on the battlefield and the possible backdrop of peace? Are we anywhere closer to it, given the current actions of both Russia and Ukraine?
On the battlefield, there is not much movement, and this is why the news goes into those strikes on civilians in Kiev and elsewhere. So it's a stalemate. The Russian army cannot advance much. We see for the last 10 months very minimal territorial gains. They couldn't even get to Pokrovsk. Pokrovsk is a kind of a big village, if not a town, and even they cannot get that. Not to mention other big cities in Donetsk and Zaporozhye. And so Russian army can only hit civilians. I have the impression only they cheer about if they kill those 3 people in Kyiv, and that's what they consider to be a military success. Obviously, it is not. On the battlefield, Russia doesn't have any success. Well, they cleared Kursk's region, which was a Russian anyway, so it's not even that any military victory. So stalemate on the battlefield. And what we see is actually more willingness and more unification between major players, United States. The G7 finance ministers agreed on sanctions on Russia, including United States. So apart from Donald Trump talks, there is a lot of diplomacy on a lower level in the US. We saw Lindsey Graham making a strong speech against Russia, accusing Russia of aggression. And Lindsey Graham is one of the most prestigious Republican senators. So we will see over time pressure on Russia, more sanctions, including by United States. I wouldn't even exclude China of putting some pressure on Putin to agree on a ceasefire, and during that ceasefire to have time to negotiate all the other issues, territorial issues, sanctions, security guarantees, and so on.
Professor Prochowski, we've obviously seen sanctions imposed on Moscow since the start of this conflict. As you've said, they've agreed to new sanctions. But are there any other levers that Western governments still have left against Russia, or is it purely left to those 2 men, Volodymyr Zelensky and Vladimir Putin, to agree on something that seems pretty out of reach right now?
Apart from sanctions, there should be also a strong support for Ukraine, including military. So the answers here are sanctions do work over time, obviously. The Russian economy cannot survive with mobilization of many countries to impose sanctions on Russia, including financial sanctions, but also it is important to support daily Ukraine. And it means not only financial, but also military support. And many countries do that. They support Ukraine militarily, financially, even politically, even statements in support of Ukraine and accepting the Ukrainian peace plan, what Zelensky proposes, diplomatically through ambassadors will be all very useful. So strong sanctions on Russia, strong support for Ukraine, and careful with negotiations, because only if Ukraine is on the table of negotiations, no negotiation without Zelensky, I will simply put it this way.
And finally, I just wanted to touch on the position of the United States, which has been ever-changing, especially after, obviously, Donald Trump came to office on January the 20th. We saw the US even side with Moscow a couple of times at the United Nations. What are your thoughts on where the US might lie in the current state of negotiations to end this war, which it says it wants to?
Yes, very disappointingly, in the beginning of the Trump administration, we saw that, those voting in the General Assembly together with Russia, absolutely unbelievable historically. But over time, we see that even the US administration is learning slowly. Again, law competent people learn slowly. We understand that, but they learn over time. The Trump administration realizes who is on the right side and who are their true allies. And these are the European Union, Canada, Australia, South Korea, other countries, Japan, and so on. So over time, we see a building unified front against Russia. And although Trump is trying to make some financial deals in Russia, that's my understanding of those visits by Steve Witkoff to Moscow, somehow to try to get some money out of Russia, but these are financial deals. And even Witkoff stopped going to Moscow. So everything which you mentioned, Thomas, is correct, but it kind of applies in the past. We hope this doesn't continue in the future.
Professor Veselin Ivanov-Popovsky, thank you very much for joining us on the programme. We now move on to the Middle East,